Welcome to the mud. Don't worry, you're safe where you are. Warm, dry, probably with a cup of tea or something stronger within reach. But 100 years ago, that same comfort would have been unthinkable. Back then, if you were lucky enough to find a dry patch, you'd guard it like treasure. If you weren't, well, you learned that there are worse things than being cold and wet. The Great War, people called it the war to end all wars. A bold claim, given that the 20th century had barely gotten started. It wasn't a clean fight of gallant charges and fluttering flags. It was industrialized slaughter, with mud as its most loyal ally. You could drown in it, lose a boot in it, even lose your sanity staring at it for too long. And yes, soldiers joked about it. They had to. When you're knee-deep in filth and someone's just been blown into what used to be your breakfast, humor becomes a survival tool. A grim, muddy kind of medicine. This story isn't about heroes and villains. It's about endurance. The kind of quiet, stubborn persistence that doesn't make statues or headlines. It's about what it meant to keep breathing when the air itself burned with gas, when the food smelled like rust, and when the only thing standing between you and chaos was a few inches of dirt. So, settle in, pull up your blanket, take a deep breath, and remember, you're just listening. You're not there. You're not staring over the lip of a trench, wondering if the next sound will be your last. You're not trying to sleep while the earth shakes from shell fire. But if you close your eyes and listen carefully, you might start to understand why some men came back and some never really did. Good night and good luck. You're going to need it. The morning of August 23rd, 1914, broke gray and quiet over Mons, Belgium. Mist hugged the low hills, the air cold and still as if nature hesitated before the storm. A British infantryman, awakened before dawn, lit a match to check his boots. Muddy, heavy, and already stained. He whispered to his mate, "If this is peace, I've met worse in boots." In a few hours, that quiet would crack. Mons would be Britain's first real battle against the Germans on the Western Front. The British Expeditionary Force, professional soldiers, not raw conscripts, stood along the canal north of Mons to defend a thin line. They were outnumbered. The Germans massed roughly twice as many men and twice as much artillery. Still, the British had something the Germans would not expect: discipline, sharp eyes, rapid rifles. At 9 o'clock that morning, the German guns opened up. The ground vibrated. Shells hissed overhead. Men crouched, heads low. The British infantry returned fire. In some sectors, German assault formations advanced in lines, as if on parade ground, bold but exposed. British volleys cut gaps in ranks. Machine guns rattled death. The river canal, muddy slopes, and tangled hedges turned into obstacles for anyone charging forward. One scene, Private Godley, near the Nimy Bridge, manning a machine gun after his officer was mortally wounded. He stayed behind, firing to cover his comrades' withdrawal. For that, he would earn a Victoria Cross. Another, Lieutenant Maurice Dease, defending the same bridge, even as he was shot repeatedly, stayed at his post until he could no more. These acts did not change the larger tide, but they added to the story of what people did when everything else was failing. By evening, the Germans had forced their way into Mons. The British held longer than many expected, but the pressure was too great. The British casualties numbered around 1,600, killed, wounded, missing. German losses are less precisely known, but estimates run up to several thousand.
The British line had to withdraw, to avoid being enveloped, to retreat in good order. Retreat, a word that always carries a sting, sometimes confusion, sometimes shame. But in those days, retreat was as tactical as advance. Over the next days, the BEF would fall back through France, trying to link with French armies, trying to avoid disaster. Would be battles at Le Cateau, actions at Eluges, skirmishes overnight, exhaustion mounting by the mile.
In the shock and chaos, many ordinary details of life in war surfaced. A sergeant wrote later that his men picked up shell fragments like souvenirs, grim proof that the enemy was closer than they dared believe. Others described the sickening smell of cordite and earth turned over by shells, the moans of wounded trudging through the mud. At night, men whispered prayers. Some tried to write letters home in dim light. Others simply stared at the sky and wondered what the next morning would bring. Shell shock had not yet become a term in common use. Psychology in uniforms was still new. But the tremors in men's minds were already visible. A soldier hearing a whistle might dive, though no shell was coming. Another might freeze at a sudden crack of twig, jumpy as a rabbit. Charles S. Myers, who later worked with shell-shock cases, would collect stories of men wounded in mind as much as body. The war was not just about bullets and gas, but the slow fracture of what a man considered safe inside his head. And irony was everywhere, hiding in jokes told quietly. One soldier, while trudging through rain and mud, observed, "I never knew how much I'd miss dry socks until now." Another, after hearing orders shouted across the lines, muttered, "When they said advance at dawn, I didn't expect a dawn like this." Those lines might have seemed petty amid the slaughter, but in the darkness they held meaning. Humor became a kind of ballast. You laugh a little so the abyss doesn't laugh first. Why dwell on Mons? Because Mons is where many illusions died. The illusion that war would be quick. The idea that professionalism alone could carry you through. The belief that bravery is enough. After Mons, soldiers understood that war is not an event. It is a grinding ordeal. It bends bodies, souls, and time itself. So in closing this chapter, picture the retreat. Columns of tired men, faces streaked with grime, wet uniforms sticking to their skin, some waving farewell to towns they leave behind, others carrying wounded comrades. The sky low, the road muddy, and a silence broken by distant thunder. You, in your bed, listening to this, are not marching. You're not risking your life for muddy ground. But these men were, and at Mons they tasted the bitter beginning of what survival in this war would demand. Let's rest a moment before we go deeper. Imagine waking up every morning to the same view, a wall of dirt, the reek of rot, and the sound of rats gnawing on something you hope isn't human. Welcome to the trenches. No glory, no flags flapping heroically in the wind, just mud. Endless, unrelenting mud. When people picture the First World War, they often think of the trenches on the Western Front. That's fair. The trench became the symbol of the entire conflict. The Germans dug in, the French dug in, and soon the British followed. By winter, both sides were sunk into the earth like moles with rifles. Each army built its own labyrinth, front line, support line, and reserve, connected by communication trenches that twisted and turned like veins under the skin of Europe. At first, the trenches were meant to be temporary, a place to hide until someone figured out how to break through. But no one did. Machine guns saw to that. Any man foolish enough to charge across open ground was met with a wall of bullets. So the armies stayed put. They dug deeper.
They built their new homes in the dirt. If you've ever complained about your apartment being damp, you'd fit right in. Water pooled at the bottom of the trench, soaking everything. Soldiers stood for hours in filthy puddles, and the skin on their feet began to rot. Trench foot, they called it. Harmless sounding, but it wasn't. The skin turned pale, then gray, then black. If left untreated, the foot had to be amputated. Medical manuals from the time described it clinically. Soldiers described it with fewer words and more swearing. One British private said, "It felt like my boots were filled with knives." The smell was impossible to forget. A mix of wet earth, unwashed bodies, decaying food, and something far worse, corpses. Men died in the trenches and were sometimes buried right there, a few inches of mud over their bodies. When rain washed that thin cover away, the dead returned to the surface, staring up at the living as if to remind them what came next. And then there were the rats, enormous, bold and fat from feeding on human flesh. One soldier wrote that the rats were the size of kittens, but quicker and meaner. They'd steal food, gnaw through packs, and sometimes crawl over sleeping men. You couldn't kill them all. For every rat you clubbed with a shovel, another seemed to take its place. "They're the real winners here," one sergeant muttered. "They get the meat and don't have to salute anyone."
Life in the trench ran on routine. Dull, miserable, necessary routine. Morning stand to meant everyone on alert, rifles ready, eyes scanning the mist in case the enemy tried a dawn raid. Then came breakfast. Tinned bully beef, hard biscuits, maybe a spoon of jam if you were lucky. After that, work. Repair the parapets, drain water, haul supplies, fill sandbags. The officers inspected rifles, the men cursed the officers. And so it went, day after day. Letters from home were the only light some soldiers had. The post arrived even under shell fire, carried by men who risked their lives to deliver a scrap of normality. A few sentences from a wife, a joke from a friend, a note from a mother saying, "Come home safe." It kept the illusion that there was still a world beyond the mud. But there were moments of absurd humor, too. Soldiers learned to laugh at the insanity around them. One British diary mentions a man who spent 2 hours trying to fry bacon over a candle, only to have a shell land nearby and blow his breakfast into the next trench. Another time, a German shouted across no man's land, "English, we are going to shell you now!" And the British cheered the courtesy. The shelling began 5 minutes later. "At least they're polite bastards," someone said. Food was a recurring joke, because it had to be. The rations were monotonous and often spoiled. Makanochi, a kind of canned stew, became infamous. Soldiers described it as grease and despair. Bread was often moldy, and tea was brewed from water that smelled like corpses. Yet, somehow, they joked about it. "You can tell the good cooks by how few of us die after eating," one wrote. Sleep was never easy. Shells exploded at random, shaking the ground. Snipers fired at any visible movement. Sometimes the trench itself collapsed under rain, burying men alive. The constant damp soaked into bones. Lice bred in uniforms, biting and crawling until every inch of skin itched. Men scratched until they bled. Doctors called it trench fever. The soldiers called it bloody misery. Even amid this filth, small rituals survived. A man might shave with cold water from a tin can, polish his buttons, or hang a photo of his sweetheart on the dugout wall. It wasn't vanity, it was defiance, proof that they were still human. Then there was the silence. Not peace, but the tense quiet between bombardments. You could hear the wind rustling the wire, the faint clink of a shovel from the enemy side. Somewhere, a man coughed. Somewhere else, someone cried softly, hoping no one heard. That stillness was worse than the noise. When shells fell, at least you knew what was happening. Silence meant uncertainty, and in war, uncertainty kills. Trench warfare wasn't just a physical grind, it was psychological erosion. Men began to live like ghosts, detached from time. Days blended into each other, marked only by letters, deaths, and the occasional ration of rum. "We don't live here," one wrote. "We just wait here." Still, the camaraderie was real. Soldiers from all walks of life, miners, clerks, farmers, students, found themselves sharing cigarettes, trading jokes, and saving each other's lives. They cursed their officers, cursed the mud, cursed God himself, but they stood together. The trench wasn't home, but the men beside you were the closest thing to family you had left. And above it all, the sky. Vast, uncaring, sometimes blue, sometimes red with dawn. Occasionally it rains so hard the trenches filled to the knees. Other days, the sun baked the corpses into the ground. The seasons turned, indifferent to the suffering below. By late 1915, the trench line stretched from the North Sea to Switzerland, 400 miles of mud and misery. Nothing like it had ever existed before, and nothing like it would again. Humanity had dug itself in and decided to stay. The soldiers adapted. They joked, they fought, they dreamed of dry socks and clean beds. And when someone asked how it was, they usually said, "Could be worse." It was gallows humor, yes, but it was also courage. Because in a place where the world had gone mad, laughter was the last sane thing left. So, welcome again to the mud. You could drown in it, choke on it, or laugh in its face. Most men managed all three. The battlefield was a place where technology and terror converged, turning the land into a laboratory of destruction. Here, the Great War introduced two of its most fearsome innovations: chemical weapons and artillery, each reshaping the nature of combat and the human experience of war. Chemical weapons were a new kind of horror. They didn't just kill, they maimed, disfigured, and terrorized. The first large-scale use of poison gas occurred on April 22, 1915, during the Second Battle of Ypres. The Germans released chlorine gas, a greenish-yellow cloud that smelled faintly of bleach. It was a suffocating, choking death. Soldiers caught in the cloud would clutch their throats, gasping for air, their lungs filling with fluid. Many died within hours, others lingered in agony for days. The horror was not just in the death toll, but in the fear it instilled. Soldiers who had faced bullets and bayonets now had to contend with an invisible enemy that could strike without warning. The gas attacks were a violation of international law, yet they became a regular part of the battlefield strategy. Phosgene gas followed chlorine in the arsenal of terror. It was more potent, more insidious. Colorless and with a faint odor of musty hay, phosgene could be inhaled without immediate symptoms. Victims might feel fine for hours, even a day, before their lungs began to fill with fluid, suffocating them slowly. It was responsible for the majority of gas-related deaths during the war. Then came mustard gas, the most feared of all. It didn't just attack the lungs, it burned the skin, eyes, and respiratory tract. Exposure could cause blisters, blindness, and internal bleeding. The gas could linger in the soil, on clothing, and in equipment, making it a persistent threat long after the initial attack. It was a weapon of terror, designed not just to kill, but to maim and demoralize. Soldiers had little defense against these attacks. Early on, there were no gas masks, no protective gear. They improvised with cloths soaked in urine or water,
but these offered little protection. As the war progressed, gas masks were developed, but they were uncomfortable and cumbersome. Wearing them for extended periods could cause fatigue and discomfort, and they didn't always fit properly, leaving areas of the face exposed. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers never knew when the next attack would come, and the fear of gas attacks permeated every moment in the trenches. Artillery, meanwhile, was the silent killer. It didn't discriminate. It didn't care if you were in a trench, a dugout, or standing in an open field. Shells could land anywhere, at any time. The sheer volume of fire was staggering. Artillery bombardments could last for hours, even days, with shells exploding in rapid succession, creating a constant barrage of noise and destruction. The blast waves from these explosions could cause internal injuries, rupturing eardrums, damaging lungs, and even affecting the brain. The psychological impact was just as severe. The constant threat of being hit, the deafening noise, and the disorienting effects of the blasts left many soldiers mentally shattered. The term shell shock was coined during this time to describe the psychological trauma experienced by soldiers. It was a condition that manifested in various ways: tremors, paralysis, blindness, and deafness, all without any physical injury. Doctors were baffled. Some believed it was a result of the concussive force of the explosions, while others thought it was a form of hysteria. Treatment was rudimentary at best. Some soldiers were sent to rest camps. Others were subjected to harsh therapies, including electric shock treatments. The stigma surrounding mental health meant that many soldiers suffered in silence, their trauma unrecognized and untreated. The combination of chemical weapons and artillery created a battlefield where survival was a matter of chance. Soldiers never knew what would kill them: a bullet, a shell, or a gas attack. The constant threat of death, the physical injuries, and the psychological trauma left deep scars. The war didn't just take lives, it took minds and bodies, leaving a generation to grapple with the aftermath. In the years following the war, the use of chemical weapons led to international agreements banning their use. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons in warfare. However, the horrors of the Great War had shown that such weapons could not be uninvented, and their legacy continued to cast a shadow over future conflicts. The impact of artillery was also felt long after the war. The development of more powerful and accurate artillery pieces during World War I set the stage for future military technology. The lessons learned, both in terms of tactics and the devastating effects of artillery, influenced military strategies in the years to come. The legacy of these weapons is a reminder of the destructive power of human ingenuity when turned toward violence. They changed the nature of warfare and left indelible marks on those who experienced them. The horrors of chemical weapons and artillery in World War I serve as a cautionary tale about the capacity for destruction and the need for vigilance in preventing such horrors in the future. The Battle of Verdun, fought from February to December 1916, stands as one of the most harrowing chapters of World War I. This protracted engagement, lasting nearly 10 months, epitomized the brutal nature of trench warfare and the staggering human cost of attrition. Both French and German forces endured immense casualties, with estimates suggesting around 700,000 individuals were killed, wounded, or went missing during the battle. The battle's origins trace back to German Chief of General Staff Erich von Falkenhayn's strategy to bleed France white by targeting Verdun, a symbolically significant fortress city. He believed that by inflicting severe losses on the French, they would be compelled to defend the position at all costs, thereby depleting their resources and morale. The Germans launched their offensive on February 21, 1916, initiating a relentless siege. The French, under General Philippe Pétain, famously vowed to "they shall not pass," committing to hold Verdun at any price. The ensuing months were marked by incessant artillery bombardments, with both sides employing massive barrages that shattered the landscape and inflicted severe psychological trauma on the troops. The terrain around Verdun became a quagmire of mud and debris, and the constant threat of death led to widespread shell shock among soldiers. The battle's intensity was further compounded by the use of poison gas, adding a new layer of horror to the already dire conditions.
Despite the heavy losses, neither side achieved a decisive victory. The French managed to recapture key positions, including Fort Douaumont and Fort Vaux, but the strategic significance of these gains was minimal in the broader context of the war. The battle ultimately exemplified the futility of attrition warfare, where immense sacrifices yielded little territorial advantage. In the aftermath, Verdun became a symbol of French national determination and resilience. The phrase, "they shall not pass," became emblematic of the French commitment to defend their homeland at all costs. The battle's legacy is commemorated at the Douaumont ossuary, where the remains of thousands of unidentified soldiers are interred, serving as a solemn reminder of the war's devastating human toll. The Battle of Verdun's impact extended beyond the immediate military outcomes. It influenced subsequent military strategies and highlighted the need for more effective coordination and planning in future engagements. The psychological scars left on the soldiers and the civilian population underscored the profound and lasting effects of war on societies. In conclusion, the Battle of Verdun stands as a testament to the horrors of war and the resilience of those who endure it. Its legacy serves as a poignant reminder of the human cost of conflict and the enduring need for peace and diplomacy in international relations. Winter in the trenches of World War I was a relentless adversary, a silent enemy that claimed more victims than many realized. The cold, damp conditions of the Western Front transformed the landscape into a frozen hellscape, where survival often hinged on endurance and ingenuity. Soldiers found themselves entrenched in a battle not just against the enemy, but against nature itself. The trenches, poorly constructed and hastily dug, became waterlogged and flooded during the winter months. Men stood for hours, sometimes days, in ankle-deep water and mud, their feet exposed to the elements. The result was trench foot, a condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions, which led to swelling, numbness, and in severe cases, gangrene and amputation. Over 20,000 British soldiers suffered from trench foot during the winter of 1914-1915. But the cold wasn't the only enemy. Trench fever, a disease spread by lice, became rampant. Characterized by high fever, headaches, and aching limbs, it incapacitated thousands of men. The lice-infested conditions were a constant source of discomfort and illness, compounding the hardships faced by soldiers. Despite these dire conditions, moments of humanity and compassion emerged. The Christmas Truce of 1914 stands out as a poignant example. Along parts of the Western Front, soldiers from opposing sides laid down their arms and met in no man's land. They exchanged gifts, sang carols, and even played impromptu football matches. This spontaneous ceasefire, though brief, highlighted the shared humanity between adversaries. However, such moments were rare. The reality of winter warfare was harsh and unforgiving.
soldiers faced constant exposure to the elements, inadequate clothing, and insufficient supplies. The cold seeped into their bones, and the mud clung to their bodies and spirits. Yet they endured. They found solace in small acts of kindness, in shared cigarettes, and in the camaraderie that developed amidst the suffering.
The winter months on the Western Front were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In the face of overwhelming adversity, soldiers found ways to survive, to support each other, and to maintain a semblance of humanity. Their stories, though often overshadowed by the larger narratives of war, are a powerful reminder of the strength and endurance that define the human condition. The Battle of Verdun, stretching from February to December 1916, was not just a clash of armies. It was a brutal test of endurance, a grueling contest of attrition that left both sides scarred. The French and Germans suffered staggering casualties, with estimates ranging from 700,000 to over 1 million combined dead, wounded, and missing. The human cost was immense, and the landscape bore the marks of this prolonged conflict. The French, under General Philippe Pétain, famously vowed to hold Verdun at all costs. This commitment led to a relentless defense, with French forces repelling numerous German assaults. The Germans, aiming to bleed France white, launched a series of offensives, capturing key positions like Fort Douaumont and Fort Vaux. However, the French counterattacks, employing innovative tactics and sheer determination, gradually recaptured lost ground. The battle's intensity was matched by the suffering endured by the soldiers. Trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions, became a rampant issue. Soldiers stood in waterlogged trenches for hours, their feet swelling and turning numb. In severe cases, gangrene set in, leading to amputations. The lack of proper footwear and sanitation exacerbated the problem. Trench fever, another affliction, spread rapidly among troops. Characterized by high fevers, headaches, and muscle pain, it incapacitated thousands. The disease was transmitted by lice, which thrived in the unsanitary conditions of the trenches. With no effective treatment, soldiers were often bedridden for weeks, further depleting the already strained ranks. Despite these hardships, moments of humanity shone through. The Christmas Truce of 1914, though preceding the battle, set a precedent for unexpected fraternization. Soldiers from opposing sides met in no man's land, exchanging gifts and sharing songs. Such instances, though rare, reminded all involved of the shared human experience amidst the horrors of war. The Battle of Verdun concluded on December 18, 1916, with no decisive victor. Both sides had suffered immense losses, and the battlefield had become a symbol of the futility of attrition warfare. The French had successfully defended their position, but at a staggering cost. The Germans, despite initial successes, failed to achieve their strategic objectives. In the aftermath, Verdun became a symbol of French national pride and resilience. The phrase, "they shall not pass," encapsulated the determination of the French forces. Memorials like the Douaumont ossuary, containing the remains of over 130,000 unidentified soldiers, serve as solemn reminders of the battle's human cost. The Verdun Memorial further commemorates the sacrifices made, honoring both French and German soldiers who fought and died in the battle. The legacy of Verdun extends beyond its immediate military outcomes. The battle highlighted the devastating effects of modern warfare on soldiers' physical and mental health. It underscored the need for better medical care, improved living conditions, and a reevaluation of military strategies.
The experiences at Verdun influenced future generations, shaping military doctrines and the approach to warfare.
In conclusion, the Battle of Verdun was more than a military engagement. It was a testament to human endurance, a stark reminder of the horrors of war, and a call for remembrance and reflection. Its lessons continue to resonate, urging all to strive for peace and to honor those who sacrificed so much. The Great War was not solely a European affair. It was a global conflict that drew in soldiers from across the world. From the deserts of the Middle East to the jungles of Africa, men from colonies and dominions far from the Western Front found themselves thrust into the chaos of war. In Africa, French forces mobilized over 200,000 men from their colonies, including Senegal, Algeria, and Morocco. These soldiers, often referred to as the tirailleurs sénégalais, faced the brutal realities of trench warfare on the Western Front. They served with distinction in major battles, such as Verdun and the Somme, enduring the same hardships as their European counterparts. Despite their contributions, many faced racial discrimination and were often relegated to the most dangerous assignments. The Indian Army's involvement in World War I was significant, with over 1 million soldiers serving in various theaters of war. 2 divisions, the Lahore and Meerut divisions, were among the first to be deployed to the Western Front in 1914. They participated in key engagements, including the Battle of Ypres, where they held critical positions under heavy fire. The Indian Corps faced challenges such as unfamiliar terrain, harsh winters, and language barriers. Despite these obstacles, they earned respect for their resilience and bravery. However, their contributions were often overshadowed in post-war narratives. In the Pacific and the Middle East, soldiers from Australia and New Zealand, collectively known as the ANZACs, played pivotal roles. The Gallipoli campaign in 1915 saw these troops land on the Gallipoli Peninsula in an attempt to secure a sea route to Russia. The campaign ended in a costly stalemate, with heavy casualties on both sides. Despite the military failure, the Gallipoli campaign became a defining moment in the national consciousness of both nations, symbolizing courage and sacrifice. From the Caribbean, soldiers from colonies such as Jamaica and Trinidad were recruited into the British West Indies Regiment. These men served in various capacities, including labor battalions and combat units, often in the Middle East and Africa. While their roles were sometimes limited, their participation marked a significant contribution to the Allied war effort. The contributions of colonial and Dominion troops were vast and varied, yet their stories were often marginalized in the broader narratives of the war. Their experiences highlight the global nature of the conflict and the shared sacrifices made by individuals from diverse backgrounds. As we reflect on the centenary of World War I, it is essential to recognize and honor the roles played by these men, whose valor and dedication were instrumental in shaping the outcome of the war. As the war raged on, the battlefields were not the only places where lives were being shaped and tested. Back home, civilians, especially women, found themselves thrust into roles they had never imagined. With men gone to fight, the home front became a new kind of battleground, one where survival was measured not in trenches, but in kitchens, factories, and ration lines. In Britain, the term munitionettes was coined to describe the women who filled assembly lines in dangerous factories, increasing shell production and working long hours to supply ammunition during WI1. Between 1914 and 1918, Britain increased shell production from roughly 500,000 per year to over 187 million. Women worked around the clock in shifts, sometimes exceeding 12 hours, to ensure that frontline units received steady supplies of ammunition. These women were not just filling in. They were essential. In fact, many factories preferred them. Their smaller hands and attention to detail made them ideal for delicate tasks like assembling fuses or wiring shells. But the work came with a price. Exposure to TNT turned their skin a sickly yellow, earning them the nickname Canary Girls. Some even gave birth to babies with the same jaundiced hue, a grim reminder of the toxic environment they worked in. Across the Atlantic, American women were also stepping into roles that had been previously off-limits. Over 1 million women worked in factories during WW1, building Liberty engines, airplanes, and munitions. They also volunteered for the American Red Cross, driving ambulances, working in canteens, and knitting clothing and medical supplies. Some even set up daycares for working mothers. But it wasn't just about filling jobs. It was about filling hearts. Governments launched massive propaganda campaigns to keep morale high. Posters urged civilians to buy war bonds, save wheat, and waste not, want not. The U.S. Food Administration even issued pamphlets with recipes for corn and bran muffins, encouraging housewives to use less wheat and meat. Yet, behind the cheerful slogans and red, white, and blue banners, the reality was often harsh. Food shortages led to long queues, and the lack of rationing initially sparked protests. Women, who had been praised as the second line of defense, found themselves facing not only the challenges of their new roles, but also the weight of expectations and the sting of inequality. In France, the situation was similarly strained. Women took on new roles in factories and agriculture, but the government implemented strict censorship and propaganda to control public opinion and maintain morale. The war also had a profound impact on French society, leading to changes in gender roles and increased government intervention in the economy. Despite the hardships, the war marked a turning point. Many countries recognized women's contributions by granting them the right to vote during or shortly after the war. In the United States, Britain, Canada, and several European nations, women were given the vote, acknowledging their pivotal role in the home front effort. But the end of the war didn't mean the end of challenges. Women who had stepped into the workforce were often pushed back into traditional roles as men returned home. However, the seeds of change had been sown. The war had shown that women could do more than just hold down the fort. They could build it. So, as we remember the soldiers who fought on the front lines, let's not forget those who held the home front together. Their stories are not just footnotes in history. They are the backbone of it. In the quiet moments of war, when the guns fell silent, it was often the women who kept the world turning. In the shadow of the trenches, beneath the churned earth of the Western Front, a silent war was being waged. It was a war of inches, of darkness, of earth and dust. A war fought not with rifles and bayonets, but with picks, shovels, and the steady drip of sweat. The Battle of Messines in June 1917 was the zenith of this subterranean conflict. For months, British and Commonwealth tunnelers had been burrowing beneath the German lines, laying mines packed with explosives. Their goal was to destroy the enemy's positions from below, to turn the earth itself into a weapon. The work was perilous. Tunnels were dug in secret, often under enemy fire, with the constant threat of collapse or flooding.
The miners, known as sappers, worked in cramped, dark conditions, sometimes for weeks without seeing daylight. Their progress was measured in feet, their success in survival. At Messines, the culmination of their efforts was a series of massive explosions. 19 mines, packed with nearly 1 million pounds of explosives, were detonated in quick succession on June 7, 1917. The blasts were so powerful that they were heard in London over 100 miles away. The ground shook, the sky darkened with smoke, and the landscape was forever altered. The explosions created craters the size of football fields, some over 200 feet wide and 40 feet deep. The force of the blasts destroyed German positions, killed thousands of soldiers, and left a scarred, pockmarked landscape. It was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in history.
But the victory came at a cost. The sappers had worked tirelessly, often under brutal conditions, to prepare the mines. Their success was hard-earned, their sacrifices largely unrecognized. Their story is one of quiet determination, of men who labored in the shadows to shape the course of history. The Battle of Messines stands as a testament to their ingenuity and resilience. It was a victory won not on the battlefield, but beneath it. A victory that changed the course of the war and the landscape of Flanders forever. In the end, the sappers' work was more than just military strategy. It was a reminder that even in the darkest depths, human ingenuity can find a way to rise. And in the silence of the tunnels, they proved that sometimes the most profound victories are those fought in the shadows. In the midst of the relentless chaos of the First World War, when the thunder of artillery and the cries of the wounded filled the air, there existed a quieter, more personal form of communication, the letters home. These letters, penned by soldiers on the front lines, served as lifelines to their families, offering glimpses into the harrowing realities of war and the enduring human spirit. One poignant example comes from a letter written by Charles Stanley Lamb, an American soldier in the AEF. In a letter composed 5 days after the armistice was signed, he wrote to his mother, "Dear Mother, by firelight on the fought-over ground of this stricken country, I pause to rush word to you of my safety plus well-being. This brief note encapsulates the soldier's relief and the enduring connection to loved ones, even amidst the devastation." Similarly, the British Army's Voices of the First World War project has preserved numerous letters from soldiers who served in France. These letters, often censored for content, still convey the deep emotions and experiences of the men who wrote them. One such letter describes the daily grind of trench life, the constant threat of death, and the longing for home. The letters were not just messages, they were windows into the soul of the soldier. They spoke of fear, of camaraderie, of hope, and of love. They were written in moments stolen between battles, by candlelight or in the dim glow of a campfire, often on scraps of paper or the backs of postcards. The handwriting was sometimes shaky, the ink smudged, but the words were always heartfelt. These letters also reveal the soldiers' resilience and their attempts to shield their families from the horrors they faced. Many soldiers downplayed their suffering, focusing instead on reassuring their loved ones. They spoke of mundane details, of the weather, of the food, of the comrades they had met, while omitting the brutal realities of trench warfare. This self-censorship was a testament to their desire to protect their families from the grim truths of war.
However, not all letters were filled with optimism. Some soldiers, particularly those suffering from what was then termed shell shock, expressed their deep despair and confusion. These letters, though less common, provide a stark contrast to the more upbeat correspondence and offer insight into the psychological toll of the war. The significance of these letters extends beyond their content. They were often the only means of communication between soldiers and their families, making them invaluable historical documents. Today, these letters are preserved in archives and museums, serving as poignant reminders of the personal experiences behind the statistics of war. In conclusion, the letters written by soldiers during the First World War offer a unique and intimate perspective on the conflict. They capture the humanity of the soldiers, their fears, their hopes, and their enduring love for their families. In a war that sought to dehumanize, these letters affirmed the resilience of the human spirit. In the spring of 1917, the French army reached a breaking point. The Nivelle offensive, launched in April, was intended to deliver a decisive blow to the Germans. General Robert Nivelle promised a breakthrough within 48 hours, but the reality was far grimmer. The offensive resulted in over 130,000 French casualties, and the anticipated victory never materialized. The soldiers, who had already endured years of grueling trench warfare, were disillusioned and exhausted. By May, widespread mutinies erupted across the French army. Approximately 68 out of 112 divisions were affected, with soldiers refusing to leave their trenches and advance into what they saw as certain death. The mutinies were not a call for surrender, but a demand for an end to futile offensives and better treatment. In response, the French military authorities took swift and harsh action. General Philippe Pétain was appointed to replace Nivelle and restore order. Under Pétain's leadership, the army implemented strict discipline, conducted numerous courts-martials, and executed 49 soldiers. Additionally, nearly 3,000 men were sentenced to penal servitude. Despite the severity of the reprisals, the mutinies highlighted the deep-seated frustrations within the ranks and the growing weariness with the war. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the British Army faced its own challenges. In September 1917, a mutiny occurred at the Ypres training camp in northern France. The camp, known for its harsh discipline and poor conditions, became the focal point of the unrest. The soldiers, many of whom were new recruits, had endured grueling training and harsh treatment. The mutiny involved a series of protests and disturbances, leading to the execution of one soldier, Jesse Robert Short. While the Ypres mutiny was smaller in scale compared to the French mutinies, it underscored the widespread discontent among the troops. The events of 1917 marked a significant turning point in the war. The mutinies and unrest revealed the fragility of military morale and the limits of authority. Both the French and British armies had to confront the reality that their soldiers were not just cogs in a machine, but individuals with their own wills and desires for survival. The year 1917 was a stark reminder that even in the face of overwhelming force, the human spirit can only endure so much before it breaks. In the summer of 1918, the war that had dragged on for years was nearing its end. The German Spring Offensive, launched earlier that year, had exhausted the German forces, and the Allies were preparing for a counteroffensive. The stage was set for a series of battles that would ultimately lead to the end of World War I. The 100 Days Offensive began on August 8, 1918, with the Battle of Amiens.
This was a decisive Allied victory, involving British, Canadian, Australian, and French troops along with American support. The Dremmen suffered approximately 30,000 casualties on the first day, while the Allies had around 6,500. This battle marked the beginning of a series of successful offensives that would push the German forces back. Following the success at Amiens, the Allies continued their advance. The Battle of St. Quentin Canal on September 29 was a significant turning point. The Allies broke through the formidable Hindenburg Line, a series of German defensive positions leading to the capture of thousands of German soldiers and much-needed supplies. As the Allies pressed forward, the German morale began to falter. The relentless pressure from the Allied forces, combined with internal unrest and the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm II, led to a collapse in the German war effort. By early November, the German government sought an armistice. On November 11, 1918, at 5 a.m., an armistice was signed in a railroad car in the Compiègne forest in northern France. The ceasefire took effect at 11 a.m., marking the end of fighting on the Western Front. Although the armistice ended the hostilities, it did not officially end the war. The formal peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, would be signed the following year. The Hundred Days Offensive had been costly. The Allies suffered approximately 700,000 casualties, while the Germans lost around 760,000, including those killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Despite the heavy losses, the offensive demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated Allied strategies and the resilience of the troops involved. The end of the war brought relief and celebration, but also a sense of uncertainty. The devastation of the conflict had left deep scars on the nations involved. The war had reshaped borders, economies, and societies. The Treaty of Versailles would impose harsh penalties on Germany, setting the stage for future tensions. The world had changed, and the legacy of the war would continue to influence global events for decades to come. Europe in 1919 was a continent of ghosts, though the streets still bustled as if nothing had happened. It was a strange, uneasy calm after 4 years of relentless violence. Cities like Verdun and Ypres had been flattened, their iconic churches reduced to piles of stone, streets scarred with craters and shrapnel, a permanent reminder that the war had never really left. For the millions who had survived, the challenge wasn't simply rebuilding homes or cities, it was rebuilding themselves. Millions had died, and millions more had returned maimed, shell-shocked, or both. Soldiers who came home carried invisible burdens that often spoke louder than any wound. Some had lost limbs, others had lost friends and entire units. One veteran might have walked into his family home and realized he didn't recognize the rhythm of ordinary life anymore. For writers and artists, the war had erased innocence and replaced it with a haunting clarity. Life could be brutal, arbitrary, and fleeting. This lost generation expressed itself through art, literature, and poetry. Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and later Erich Maria Remarque gave voice to the shared trauma, writing about mud, blood, and the absurdity of orders that sent men to die in waves. They captured the haunting duality of war, the beauty of a sunrise over a battlefield, and the smell of decay mingled in the same breath. Cemeteries stretched endlessly, neat rows of white crosses or simple wooden markers marking the graves of men whose names were often unknown. The sheer scale of loss was staggering.
Families tried to comprehend it, but the numbers were almost comically impossible to grasp. Thousands buried in small towns, hundreds of thousands across regions. Memorials were erected, but they could never truly honor the human cost. Societies struggled with the reintegration of veterans. Jobs were scarce and economies were broken. Many ex-soldiers suffered from lingering physical ailments, trench foot, respiratory problems from gas attacks, or chronic pain from old injuries. Others battled psychological trauma, though it was poorly understood at the time. Shell shock was the term that covered everything from nightmares to paralyzing fear, and many were dismissed, misunderstood, or even punished. Communities often lacked the resources to help, leaving many veterans isolated and alienated.
Meanwhile, women, who had carried the weight of factories, farms, and offices while men fought, faced a new challenge, a society that expected them to return to their previous domestic roles. Yet the war had shifted gender expectations, planting seeds for social change, suffrage movements, and debates over labor that would continue for decades. Children grew up in households shadowed by war stories, rationing, and the absence of fathers, learning early that the world was a precarious place. Politics was another minefield. Borders had been redrawn with little regard for culture or history. Empires had crumbled. The Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, and German empires were replaced by fragile nation-states struggling to assert authority. Revolutions and uprisings flared in the chaos as people tested the limits of the fragile peace. Economic collapse and inflation further strained populations, feeding resentment and, in some cases, radicalism. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, imposed harsh reparations on Germany, sowing seeds of anger and instability that would bloom again in the next generation. Despite the devastation, life continued. Markets reopened, children played among ruins, and farmers returned to fields scarred by shell craters. Daily life required a stubborn, almost absurd resilience. People learned to laugh, to celebrate small victories, and to carry on, even if every moment was tinged with memory of what had been lost. Survivors carried forward a mixture of trauma, endurance, and a strange, necessary humor to navigate a world that had been irrevocably altered. The generation that lived through World War I was marked by a collective consciousness of loss. They understood better than most the fragility of peace and the cost of human ambition. This awareness shaped art, literature, politics, and social movements for decades. Europe had been scarred, but its people endured, creating the foundation for a future they could scarcely imagine. A future that would demand both remembrance and courage, even in the shadow of what they had already endured. The war ended, or at least the shooting stopped, but its echoes never truly faded. Europe in 1919 might have been quiet, but it was quiet in the way a house feels after a fire. The walls still stand, but everything inside has been altered, some beyond recognition. The First World War didn't just kill millions of soldiers and civilians, it reshaped the very fabric of society, politics, and even thought. It planted seeds that would grow in the decades to follow, often in ways no one could have predicted. The most obvious impact was political. 4 great empires, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, collapsed under the strain of war. Borders were redrawn with the precision of a mapmaker who had never met the people living there. New nations like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia emerged, carving spaces from old empires. But political change was messy. Nationalism surged, revolutionary movements simmered, and ideologies clashed in ways that would set the stage for future global conflict. Governments were fragile, economies were shattered, and the wounds of 1914-1918 had not healed. They were simply hidden under a veneer of treaties, flags, and speeches about peace. Society itself had been transformed. Millions of men had been killed or maimed, leaving a demographic imbalance that changed families and communities forever. Women, who had taken on roles in factories, farms, and offices during the war, now demanded recognition and rights. The social upheaval was subtle and often uneven, but it was real. A generation of children grew up with stories of trenches, mud, and shells as bedtime tales, sometimes more vivid than any fairy tale. And the adults who survived carried a shared knowledge that life could turn cruel in an instant. The psychological toll of the war rippled outward in ways that historians and psychologists are still unraveling. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, affected millions. Soldiers returned home alive but emotionally fractured, unable to reconcile the life they had endured with the life waiting for them. Writers, artists, and musicians absorbed the trauma, turning it into literature, painting, and music that reflected despair, disillusionment, and sometimes bitter humor. The lost generation became a cultural touchstone, embodying the scars of a conflict that could never be fully understood by those who hadn't lived through it. Technologically, the war accelerated change at a breakneck pace. Tanks, airplanes, and chemical weapons had demonstrated both the potential and the peril of modern science. Governments learned that industrial efficiency could be harnessed for destruction on a scale never before imagined. The world had glimpsed the future of warfare, and it was terrifying. Civilians had become collateral damage. Cities had become battlefields, and the old rules of engagement were obsolete. Humanity had discovered that ingenuity without conscience could be deadly, and perhaps, inexorably, it would return. And yet, amid all this destruction, life persisted. Crops were planted in shell-pocked fields, children laughed amid ruins, and markets reopened in cities that had been shattered. People learned, quickly and painfully, that survival required more than courage on the battlefield. It required endurance, adaptability, and a stubborn hope that tomorrow could be better than today. Even in mourning and despair, there was a strange resilience, a shared understanding that the world could move forward if only its people refused to be broken entirely. Looking back, the First World War was not just a chapter in history, it was a warning. It showed how quickly civilization could be upended when politics, technology, and human ambition outpaced empathy and foresight. It left Europe forever changed, not just physically, but in the psyche of its people. And while the guns fell silent, the lessons and the ghosts remained. Veterans, poets, and ordinary citizens carried these lessons into the next decades, often unwillingly, sometimes with bitterness, sometimes with cautious hope. One soldier wrote in his diary during the armistice words that capture the paradox of that time. "We thought we were fighting for the future, but the future died with us." The irony is that the future didn't die. It simply bore the imprint of everything they had endured. Cities, borders, and governments would rebuild, but the human experience of war, the understanding of how fragile peace could be, was indelibly etched into memory. The shadow of 1914-1918 stretched far beyond the trenches, beyond the cemeteries, into every corner of the century that followed. In the end, the First World War left the world with a question as heavy as any artillery shell. Could humanity learn from the past, or would the same mistakes repeat, dressed in new uniforms on new battlefields? The answer would not be immediate, and history has shown it is still unfolding. But the lesson was clear to those who survived. Even in the darkest, muddiest trenches, amid horror that defied imagination, humans endure, and the consequences of failing to remember endure even longer.